Welcome everyone to our End Rape series as part of the Representation Project's effort to end sexual violence. I'm Dr. Caroline Heldman, the Executive Director of the Representation Project. And this is a series that features the top experts on sexual violence prevention, causes, and consequences. I just want to give a quick trigger activation warning. We will be discussing sexual violence, so please be aware of that. And if you are in a triggered state, it might be a wise idea to maybe watch this recorded so that you can stop and start at will. So let's jump right into it. I am so honored today to interview a friend for 10 years, Dr. Tricia Lin. She is a 17th generation daughter of Taiwan. T-Chun Tricia Lin is the director and professor of women's studies at Southern Connecticut State University. She traveled from her native island to pursue a doctorate degree in continental philosophy and theory. And in the process, she found herself home in ethnic studies and women's studies. She wrote her dissertation on Asian American women's cultural and literary productions. And this was really her first step away from her Euro-American centered education, hopefully a process that more academics, an arc that more academics experience. Since her doctoral days, Dr. Lin's research and teaching have gone intensely ethnic, feminist, and post-colonial. Among her recent projects is a comparative cultural studies of Indigenous and diasporic women's writing from the Caribbean and Pacific Islands. And before joining the Women's Studies faculty at Southern in 2004, Dr. Lin taught writing and literature and Asian American literature at City University of New York, Borough of Manhattan Community College for a decade, from 1994 to 2004. Where she discovered her passion for teaching for liberation of all minds and found her calling in the struggle for peace and justice. Dr. Lin is a former president of the National Women's Studies Association, and she also co-founded Faculty Against Rape in 2013. Welcome, Dr. Lin. Just an honor to speak with you today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Let's jump right into it. You will see some therapy kittens, so we won't let them derail us, but they are here to remind us of, this is a heavy subject. So let's get started. Tell us about your work with sexual violence prevention. What inspired your journey, and how do you bring your academic training to bear on this issue?
Thank you, Dr. Heldman Caroline, for this opportunity to engage in the conversation with someone, whose work on sexual violence prevention and awareness I have always held in very high regard. I must say I cringed somewhat at the mention of expert. I claim no expert in sexual violence prevention. Like many of us on this journey, gender justice journey, we happened on it through various life circumstances. So I'm going to just touch on my life briefly. So my life as an academic in the West, mostly United States, first in the field dominated by European white male presences and thoughts, and then in a white and male-centered interdiscipline called comparative literature, is a long and arduous process of learning about myself as a gendered AAPI person, Asian Pacific Islander person, and waking up and realizing the gravity of sexual violence plaguing our world, academia being no exception, perhaps one of the worst pits. I had to unlearn, relearn, and educate myself about sexual violence and what sexual violence is. So this is going to be a little bit rough. Growing up in Taiwan, I was socialized to think being female is a damnation, a bad karma. Sexual violence, as we understand it today, is what comes with being, comes with the damnation of being a female. Nothing to be made a fuss about, because you could have provoked such a violence. The fault could be your own. Today, we have the language and analysis for all the violence inflicted upon victim, survivor, receiver of sexual violence. But personally, it's taken me a long time to realize that I've been a survivor of multiple forms of sexual violence, both inside academia and out. Now, my position as a faculty in English and ethnic studies, and then as a faculty chair of women's and gender studies, has not really offered a formal opportunity in taking up a role in sexual violence prevention per se. For most of the time, my work is behind the scenes, offering colleagues, students, associates support, personal, emotional, moral, and whenever possible, institutional and legal. But the education against sexual violence is in my teaching. I put discussions and studies of all movements against sexual violence on my syllabi, just about, I say, every single syllabus. It is also in the programming and organizing that I do, organizing of conferences and symposia, focusing on violence prevention and healing. It is also borne out in my networking with colleagues and activists of all backgrounds and genders, such as Dr. Caroline Heldman. And that work includes my being involved in FAR, Faculty Against Rape. So with this, I would just say really my so-called violence prevention work has been really a center of my focus, but it's not in my job descriptions.
And how wild is that, right? That a lot of folks are taking on these informal roles as essentially sexual violence interventionists, support social workers, directing people to services. So it's unpaid labor that is falling on your shoulders and the shoulders, mostly of women, and of course, often women of color are doing this extra labor. And it's not just in the academy, it's in every industry, right? Who's doing the advocacy work, who's pushing for that work. And I'll push back a little bit that I absolutely think of you as an expert and have used your writings and advocacy reflections for many years. And thank you for that, Tricia, Dr. Lin. So let's talk, let's put on your academic hat, right? Your professor hat, and talk about, we have some different systems of power at play with sexual violence, right? So it's an epidemic, and there are lots of big systems of power at play, including patriarchy, historic and contemporary practices of colonialism. Can you speak about how patriarchy and colonialism are shaping the contours of sexual violence?
Oh my goodness, all these great questions. Yes, we often say sexual violence is an epidemic, but calling it an epidemic almost implies that it would go away, right? It is becoming almost part of the culture, I would say. So here, with or without my professor hat, my academic hat, I'll just say I have known this for a long time, since I was a little girl, the imbalance of gender dynamic or powers, very imbalanced power dynamic between genders, among genders. In a Confucian culture, for those of us not familiar with Confucian, it is the kind of teaching based on the writing of Confucius. someone who lived over 3,000 years ago, in the Confucian culture, which is absolutely it's patriarchal. I will just stop there to say it's a very rigid hetero-patriarchal culture. In the Confucian culture that I grew up in, patriarchy, particularly hetero-patriarchy, is not simply the cultural code. It is the norm. It is inscribed in the annals. School kids were made to memorize, recite, and regurgitate. At least that's the situation when I was growing up. Confucius says all kinds of hateful things about women and female existences, as well as people of classes other than his own, which is aristocrat. I would just say this may be triggering. We had to memorize, and so very often end up internalizing these things, including 为君女子与小人难养也. Okay, so only women and little people, little-minded people, or there are many ways to interpret what little-minded people are. Only women and small people or little people are hard to cultivate, to educate. And to complete this education of patriarchy, there is a whole lesson about women's submission and obeisance. So I grew up having to memorize all these terrible things like 女子无才便是德, meaning oh gosh, how would I translate? A woman without talent is virtuous. That is to say, women are encouraged not to be educated. And then another one is even harsher. It says, obey your father before marriage, obey your husband, and obey your son once widowed. So in other words, these hard to cultivate people are actually given a lot of education about submission and obeisance. I was told, getting personal here, I was told as a girl that I was very lucky that my father would allow me to be educated. Every time my rebellion found its tiniest expression, I would be threatened with messages like, watch out, if you keep on behaving like this, you'll be sold, that I would be sold. Growing up, that was a kind of thing, right? If a girl is not behaving herself, she would be just given away like that. Or this is a very harsh one. I should have aborted you, you useless girl. So the preference and primacy given to a male child at home, i.e. my baby brother, is a constant reminder of my inborn female inferiority. No wonder women and girls are known to have participated in their own erasure and in the hetero-patriarchal order of misogyny. It is, you can say it's for survival. At the same time, one wonders, I often wonder how one survives such a deep level of cultural violence. So sexual violence is, in my view, just one manifestation of violence and violation of female existence. The violence is all-encompassing. Heteropatriarchy and misogyny work hand in hand in creating a culture that is violent to women and girls on all levels. Emotionally, sexually, culturally, psychically, physically, legally, spiritually, and so on.
So
I think Yeah, I think I'll just stop here.
Oh, I don't want
I
to cut
need
you
to
short. This
say,
is great.
yeah, I just need to say it is slightly triggering just having to recount some of childhood memories.
Thank you for being so vulnerable and, weaving in your personal experience with systems critique. I think one of the big ways that patriarchy and the white heteropatriarchy that you mentioned persists is that we individualize the problem. We imagine that we are alone. We imagine that we are the one experiencing it. And often we don't have the words, the language to identify what we're experiencing. And of course, it's a systems experience. It's a cultural experience. It is not an individual experience, but we don't rise up against it. We don't challenge it. We don't even maybe necessarily have the language to push against it because we don't see it as a system. So I just want to point out that you drawing that personal connection into the theory is, it's gold. That's how we understand. That's how we identify, we name the systems, and then we push back. And I'm hoping you can speak a little more. I watched the Barbie movie last weekend, which I think was shocking to people because it exposed patriarchy in such an obvious way. And we study this, we know it's there. I was impressed by the way in which it just flipped the worlds and showed the patriarchy. Can you talk about how patriarchy is functioning and operating in the US? Because I think, too, there's this idea that certain countries are way further ahead than other countries when it comes to intersectional gender justice. And I would argue that's not the case. We can look at lots of different metrics, but the system is just different. It is morphed in order to maintain in whatever place it's in. So this is a really long-winded question. Can you talk about how the white heteropatriarchy is operating and functioning in the US?
White heteropatriarchy is no different from red heteropatriarchy or from yellow heteropatriarchy. At the same time, in a world that where white is norm, right? Where white supremacy seems to be rearing its ugliest head. I would say that the what it has done is that it has found its expressions in all forms. I found it most cynical in recent presidential political campaigns where women and girls would be wearing self-hating slogans or as supporting a sexual someone with a very, very long record of sexual harassment, sexual violence. So I would say it is a lot of times not detected because it's people can I would just say that it's considered norm and to such an extent that it permeates into many other communities, right? So for example, in the indigenous community, which is something I have to learn about, that the white heteropatriarchy and gets transmitted, and and this is a very known vagina monologue a piece. It's called oh my goodness, the title is about hair. The anyway, it is about a Lakota woman lamenting a loss of culture and loss of the land and their men to a white violence and colonialism and white heteropatriarchy.
Thank you for unpacking that. Patriarchy functions in lots of different places and lots of different ways, but it has constants. And I think that's important to keep in mind, right? According to many scholars, the oldest form of oppression that serves as the blueprint for other forms. And as we're studying lots of systems of oppression, right? Whether it's fat phobia or ableism or racism or sexism, there are they operate and function in very similar ways. There are patterns, and there are patterns when they're threatened. There are patterns in the ways they respond, and your wisdom here is really helpful in kind of unpacking that. Shifting gears slightly, and also just to let the audience know, we want to hear from you. We will address all of your questions, hopefully get to all of them. So put them in the Q&A. I have a few more questions, but really we want to make this a conversation. Dr. Lin, what are some things about sexual violence that you wish everyone knew, or myths or things you wish that people would unlearn about sexual violence?
Oh my goodness. Okay, my wish list. I would say that sexual violence is not inevitable. That it is not the way things always are, right? As I was, was told at some point to believe in, and that every one of us can be and must be an agent of change. And I'm going to invoke the amazing Arundhati Roy, "Another world is possible," right? On a quiet day, I can hear her breathe. And indeed, another world is possible. Because if sexual violence should be inevitable, if we were, I would have been buried deep, still today in the killing weight of misogyny, of patriarchy. And I guess I will just say a little bit, the work to undo sexual violence is connected to all other restorative movements, such as environmental justice, racial justice, or other forms of movements. In the wisdom that I have learned from the teaching of indigenous peoples, the respect for all sentient beings is profoundly tied to our respect and love for Mother Earth. And the violence, so it's been made clear by many activist scholars, many of them indigenous, that violence against sexual violence is tied to violence against our world, our Mother Earth. And I can mention a few titles, but I think we can spare that at the moment. Why we will violence prevention, we must do all that we can to teach about love of the land, the peoples, all beings, and ourselves first and foremost. It is not enough to prevent, we must love. As to how we achieve this act of love of all things and beings, that will be another topic. And I believe that's ultimate prevention of violence. And I will stop here. So that's a kind of long wish list, and a little bit more about that. We have to go beyond prevention.
Well, I would love to just follow up with so many things you just said, but we have the time. If you brought up indigenous feminist approaches as well as eco-feminist approaches, there's a big overlap there. So someone who wants to learn more about this, if you've never thought about the connection between how we exploit nature and sexual violence that is gendered, what should people know? What should they be reading? How should they be pursuing more wisdom on that topic?
Oh, wow. I mean, thank you for that invitation. The list is very long. I will start, there are a couple of, a few books that are, the titles are just so obvious, pointing out the connection. One is Sarah Deer's The Beginning and End of Rape. Um, it's Beginning and End of Rape, and the subtitle is Confronting Sexual Violence in Native America, 20. And another one that is probably familiar to several people here, I'm not sure, is Andrea Smith, The Conquest, Sexual Violence in American Indian Genocide. One of my old-time favorite writer, activist, artist is Leanne Beta Samosake Simpson, who's Anishinaabe, has an essay that is just beautiful called Not Missing, Not Murdered, Rebellion Against Colonial Gender Violence. And her book, 2017 book titled As We Have Always Done, its subtitle is Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance, is a very hopeful note, because it's really, as we have always done, writing for a general, audience, showing another world is possible, in which, she lays out and quotes many people about the connection between the violence of, female beings as well as transgender beings, and the our environment, right? And there's so many beautiful podcasts. One that I constantly go to is All My Relations, right? That's by Matika Wilbur and Adrian Keene and a few other producers. And it has so many beautiful episodes about this particular topic. Yeah, the list is actually very long, and there are also artists. And I would also name a Canadian hip hop group, Indigenous group, 1491s. 1491s has a piece that I found just incredibly moving every time I use it, because I put it in my syllabi. It's called To an Indigenous Woman.
We will link to your whole list. But how wonderful that there is this bounty of theory, scholarship, right, on this link, on this issue. So for folks who haven't thought about it, it's really kind of mind-blowing. And this is why I was so excited to talk to you today, Dr. Lin, because a lot of times when we talk about sexual violence, we do view it as inevitable, and it's really difficult to move into that political imaginary, that space where we can imagine a completely different world where women are not always already raped or rapeable, right? And really moving into what that would look like. And you've told us what your political imaginary would look like, right? And the answer is love. And I'm hoping I'll just end quickly on this, and we'll open it up to questions. Can you tell viewers a little bit more about what you mean by love and how it is the ultimate answer to violence?
Wow. That's a challenge. Okay, I'm going to do my very best. Love, in its most profound sense, that unconditionally, that every life is sacred, and that starts with you, right? Love yourself, and love all the fellow beings. That includes the squirrel that just came up to my balcony, right? And the kitty in your arms, right? And the wind. I'm also talking about the elements, right? And embracing every moment, however negative it may be, as a moment of teaching and spreading love.
Oh, I love that so much. Thank you. And this is Frida making her first appearance as a therapy kitten. We have some great questions. Okay, anonymous attendee says, it is a lot, but thank you so much for sharing. It really is helping with my perspective and growth. Truly, I'm awestruck by how you've articulated it, Dr. Lynn. Okay, so that wasn't a question. That was just reiterating how powerful it is, how personal narrative is so powerful when we're doing this work. Anonymous attendee asks, what about abolition? This seems like a lot of connections to abolition and transformative justice.
Absolutely. What a great point. Some of the things that, I use the word love. It could be freedom. It could be emancipation. It could be abolition. And I think abolition is, this is really plain the semantic. I think they are facets of a one big energy, positive energy, right? I call it love, right? And compassion. There are other words to describe it. And in my mind, I go to one of my, I don't religion, so if I invoke a deity, that's not because I'm trying to evangelize at all. But in my culture, I grew up in a Buddhist, Taoist, household, and all present and omnipresent existence is Guan Yin. Guan Yin is a bodhisattva. I'm not going to use its maybe just because its Sanskrit name is not really fluent in my tongue. I'm afraid to say it wrong, but Guan Yin means Guan Shi Yin, literally in my language, in Mandarin, means observing sounds of the world, cries or sufferings of the world. So the story is as follows. Guan Yin, or this particular bodhisattva, is like other bodhisattva, they're really working on their on themselves to achieve nirvana, the ultimate being existence that everyone desires. But what makes Guan Yin different from the others is that because they are so compassionate, they listen to the sounds of the world, and in the script, there's a description of one about to cross the river to the other shore of deliverance. That is to say, nirvana. And these sounds are calling. So they decide that no, my own deliverance is not enough. I must return to help all others. My personal nirvana would mean nothing if this is only for myself. So I always take that lesson very, very. I carry that with me. This is what the shape of compassion is like. This is what love is like. This is my own my well-being is deeply connected with all others, right? So the dedication, the devotion to others is as important as my own achieving nirvana. So I forgot what prompted me to say this, except to say this is another way to say that's abolition, right? The question, the abolition, the emancipation, right? This is all part of love.
And what's so fascinating about what you're saying, just to put it in the context of this series, what I hear you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that sexual violence is really it's an outcome. It's not a core. It is an outcome of heteropatriarchy. And
Mhm.
so if we really want to address it, it's not enough to pass legislation. It's not enough to file court cases. It's not enough for colleges and other institutions to put in policies. That if we want to address sexual violence, we have to actually address the underlying heteropatriarchy that is driving it, and the culture you envision shifting to is one based on love and compassion and freedom and kindness. So just to really like hammer that point home, because oftentimes when we're talking about sexual violence, we're talking about stats, we're talking about legislation, but all of that is out here on the margins because it's a symptom of the problem. And the problem is the heteropatriarchy. And the answer is love, for the quick hand of love. Yeah, so really what that means is if we want to shift this, we're going to have to shift the culture. We can't just
Yeah,
shift sexual
absolutely.
violence.
I think all that is, as you said, the stats, the legislature, the policy, all of that, all of that is very important.
Yeah.
That work needs to go on. At the same time, if we teach every boy and girl to love, the land, to love their mother, to love their themselves, to respect everyone around them, I think we that will go a very long way. Maybe one day we won't need all these, not definitely not in my lifetime, but but I maybe not, maybe I don't know, I shouldn't give up hoping, but just to say that I if everyone's taught to do meditation, to slow down, to do yoga. I mean, not to promote one thing over the other, but to say that the mental, spiritual work goes along with all the other work that we are doing.
Amen. Yep. Okay. So all of it is necessary, but if we really want to shift it, get at the core. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, right? There's no wheel spinning with legislation or policies. That's the kind of triage in between this and our new culture, a better culture. We have a nuts and bolts question about activism and networks, and you had touched on this briefly about who you work with and how you work with them. But this person is asking which books you would recommend to young survivor activists who want healthier and more effective practice, and why coalitional activism is so important.
Oh my goodness. That is a great point. I really don't think any activism is not coalitional. It has to be. One may not realize that it's coalitional, but I cannot think of any movement that I'm part of or that I admire is not coalitional, right? Um, it is now talked a lot more often that what we consider to be the first wave, the feminist work in the 19th century in the United States, is actually largely inspired by indigenous Haudenosaunee women, right? So there's indigenous feminism or indigenous women's work, cultural work that really propelled what we know today as feminism. So it's always coalitional, and some of these so-called founding the early movement makers, they were adopted into indigenous clans. They have their tribal, what we call today tribal memberships.
It's interesting how we tend to, it's such a good point. We tend to erase mostly the work of women of color when we are talking, when we just classify the first and second waves of feminism as white women's movements, which is a really sloppy, ahistorical read of history. And you're just to highlight that, absolutely right. And I know a lot of your work has really been to expose and to reveal.
Yeah, right. Sorry, I think there was a moment I kind of got cut out and you got cut out. But I would just say that, you know, it's a work of white supremacy. We always have to be aware of all the forces against us working with each other. The question is so great and complex. I'm afraid I'm only picking up the last bit of coalitional piece, but you know, it's a lot longer. But I don't know if I have time to go back to it. But maybe a way to address is to offer maybe titles later. I don't know. You let me know.
Yeah, advice for young activists. But you know, what's interesting is this other, the question in the queue now, maybe has a lot of overlap. Anonymous attendee writes, thank you for all of the insights you've shared. Do you have any advice for people who work with young folks, that would be mothers, professors, etc., on how to provide them the armor necessary to exist in this world without making them feel like rape is inevitable?
Uh, I don't think every young person is the same. I feel the weight of that question. That's why I kind of sighed first. And I also feel the love of the person raising the question, right? Working with, um, you know, younger activists. But I would say they are, in my experience, younger. I'm often uh, their student. I learn from them, right? They listen to, because everyone coming to the movement, coming to the meeting, eager to contribute, all walk in with some ideas already. And I think the message is that the message of hope should not be diminished. That is to say, you know, we are doing this work because we believe in the possibility. We believe in a different future from what we're, you know, experiencing. And I can personally say that that in my 20 plus years in the women's and gender studies, you know, I probably would have submitted myself to pessimism or this determinism, you know, the tone of the, well, this is what how things are. If I had not said to myself, I refuse to waste my energy. If I'm putting in some work here, I demand some result.
I'm just, yep, reflecting on the power of hope. So you are, as you noted, essentially planting seeds for trees, the shade of which you will never see. You said it's not likely. We're not going to shift the culture in our lifetime. But you don't give in to pessimism. You don't give in to inevitability. Can you talk more about that, what your internal process is for folks who are perhaps survivors, survivor activists, who are fighting and feeling a little, fighting the system, fighting for their own justice? Can you speak to them about how it is that you maintain that hope?
You know, hope is a very, very powerful medicine. And we all have it. Every one of us carries a lot of mana, the native Hawaiians say the medicine. We all have a lot of medicine. Pessimism, you know, or thinking things would always stay the same is a kind of toxic, you know. And I would say hope is that I don't know how I can tell people to hope, except you know, to even telling oneself that this will happen. My energy will, you know, will not be wasted. Or telling you, I believe in what I'm doing, even though you might not be. I would say that positive thinking is sort of calling up certain DNAs in your body. People have done some science study, you know, scientific studies about about hope, faith, and stuff. Doesn't when I say faith, I don't mean religion per se. All of that is very powerful, incredibly powerful. So I make it a mantra, just say, I believe in what I do. I believe in myself. And these sayings out there are not just a fashion or you wear on your t-shirt. They really mean something very powerful, beyond what I can express, because I just say that it's so terrifying that's why patriarchy wants to tear us down. They don't want us to believe in ourselves. But if what they say were right, I would not be here today. I would I would be long crushed. I'll just say this quickly. For a long time, I realized my whole education was so patriarchal. Everyone was trying everything possible to stop me from studying women's studies. Everyone, literally, every chance possible, I was warned against it. Every chance possible, I was warned against pursuing ethnic studies, women's studies, gender, race, class. But it's just like Mother Nature. It wants to grow. It's always going somewhere. And I tuned into some of those signs, and I picked one up, and there was no return. So I want to say that the hope is in you, love is in you, and we have the power, and we have the powers to really unlock all these miseries in the world.
Beautiful way to end. Dr. Tricia Lynn, thank you so much for your advocacy, your academic work, which is oftentimes also advocacy with a scholarly flair, and for being so vulnerable today and really tying in the personal story with the theory in such a powerful way. So appreciate you and your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And thank you so much, Dr. Hellman, for your work. Really, thank you.
Well, it's a mutual admiration society of two. And also here's Harvey. He looks a lot like his sister Frida, but this is little Harvey. So for folks who are joining us today, we thank you so much for being here. I know this is a tough conversation, and hopefully you've learned as much as I have from Dr. Lynn. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.